On our honeymoon night, my wife whispered a name I had never told anyone before, and that single slip shattered everything I thought I knew about her and our marriage. My wife whispered the wrong name, a name I had never told anyone. Let me start from the beginning. My name is David, and I thought I knew everything about love until that night in the Maldives changed everything I believed about my marriage, my wife, and myself. Sarah and I had been together for 3 years before I proposed. She was perfect in every way that mattered to me. Beautiful, intelligent, kind, and most importantly, she seemed to understand me in ways no one else ever had. We met at a coffee shop downtown where she worked as a barista while finishing her psychology degree. I was immediately drawn to her gentle smile and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams of helping people. Our relationship progressed naturally. We moved in together after a year, adopted a cat named Machi, and fell into a comfortable routine that felt like home. Sarah had this incredible ability to make me feel completely understood and accepted. She would listen to my work frustrations for hours, remember the smallest details about my childhood stories, and somehow always knew exactly what to say when I was having a difficult day. When I decided to propose, I spent months planning the perfect moment. I knew Sarah loved surprises, but hated being the center of attention, so I chose a quiet spot in the botanical gardens where we had our first official date. I had the ring custom made with a small sapphire because she once mentioned that diamonds felt too traditional for her taste. Everything went exactly as I had imagined. She said yes through happy tears, and we spent the rest of the evening making plans for our future together. The wedding planning was surprisingly smooth. Sarah seemed to have opinions about everything, but they all aligned perfectly with what I wanted too. She preferred a small ceremony with close family and friends rather than a big celebration. She wanted to honeymoon somewhere tropical and peaceful. She even loved the house we looked at together, the same house I had been secretly hoping we would choose. It was almost too good to be true how perfectly we seemed to match on every decision. The wedding day itself was beautiful. Sarah looked stunning in a simple but elegant dress that she had found at a vintage boutique. During our vows, she spoke about how she felt like she had been searching for me her entire life, how meeting me felt like finally coming home. I remember thinking that I was the luckiest man alive to have found someone who loved me so completely. We flew to the Maldives the next day for our honeymoon. The resort was everything we had hoped for: overwater bungalows, crystal clear water, and complete privacy. We spent our days snorkeling, reading on the deck, and talking about our plans for the future. Sarah seemed more relaxed than I had ever seen her, almost like she was finally allowing herself to fully unwind after months of wedding stress. For the first few days, everything was perfect. We made love, we laughed, we talked about starting a family someday. Sarah seemed completely present and happy, and I found myself thinking that this was exactly how I had always imagined married life would feel. But looking back now, I realized there were small things that should have caught my attention. The way she sometimes seemed to know things about the resort layout before we explored it together. How she never seemed surprised by any of the local customs or food, even though she claimed it was her first time visiting the Maldives. On our 4th night there, something changed. We had spent the day exploring a nearby island and returned to our bungalow tired but happy. We had dinner on our private deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Sarah seemed quieter than usual during dinner, almost thoughtful in a way that felt different from her usual contemplative moods. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled and said she was just thinking about how lucky we were to have found each other. We went to bed around 10 o'clock, both of us exhausted from the day in the sun. I fell asleep almost immediately, but sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to Sarah moving beside me. At first, I thought she was just shifting in her sleep, but then I realized she was awake and seemed to be whispering something. I stayed very still, not wanting to disturb her if she was having some kind of dream or talking in her sleep. But as I listened more carefully, I realized she was speaking clearly and deliberately, not with the confused mumbling of someone who was sleeping. She was lying on her side facing away from me, and her voice was so soft I could barely make out the words. That's when I heard it. She whispered a name, clear as day. Marcus, she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the wrong name, it was the tenderness in her voice, the intimacy that should have been reserved for me, especially on our honeymoon. But here's the thing that made it truly terrifying. Marcus was my brother's name. My twin brother, who had died in a car accident when we were 17 years old. I had never told Sarah about Marcus. Not once in our 3 years together. It wasn't that I was deliberately hiding him from her, it was just too painful to talk about. My family never spoke about him anymore. It was an unwritten rule that we had all agreed to follow after years of therapy and grief counseling. Talking about Marcus only brought back the guilt and the what-ifs that had nearly destroyed my parents' marriage and sent me into a depression that took years to overcome. The accident happened on a rainy night in November. Marcus and I had been arguing about something stupid. I can't even remember what it was about now. He stormed out of the house and took his car, even though I knew he had been drinking. I should have stopped him, should have taken his keys, should have gone with him. Instead, I let my anger keep me in my room while my brother drove to his death on a slick mountain road. After Marcus died, I became obsessed with the idea that I should have died instead. He was the better twin in every way that mattered. He was funnier, more outgoing, better at sports, better with girls. Everyone loved Marcus. He lit up every room he walked into, while I was always the quiet, serious one standing in his shadow. The guilt of surviving when he didn't nearly killed me, and it took years of therapy to get to a place where I could function normally again. I had made a conscious decision never to tell Sarah about Marcus because I didn't want to burden our relationship with my grief and guilt. I wanted to be the best version of myself for her, not the broken person who had spent years wishing he had died instead of his brother. I thought I was protecting both of us by keeping that pain separate from our happiness together. So, how did Sarah know his name? How did she know to whisper it with such tenderness in the middle of our honeymoon night? I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she would hear it. Sarah continued to whisper, but I couldn't make out any other words. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, she went quiet and her breathing returned to the steady rhythm of sleep. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stared at the ceiling of our bungalow, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the stilts, and tried to come up with any rational explanation for what I had heard. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe she had said something else that sounded like Marcus. Maybe I was still half asleep and had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. The question was what it meant, and what I was supposed to do about it. The next morning, Sarah woke up as sunny and affectionate as always. She made coffee on our little kitchenette and brought it to me on the deck, kissing my forehead and commenting on how beautiful the morning was. She seemed to have no memory of the night before, no awareness that anything unusual had happened. I found myself studying her face, looking for any sign of deception or guilt, but she seemed completely normal. I decided to test her. Casually during breakfast, I mentioned that I had a brother once. Sarah looked up from her fruit bowl with mild interest and asked what happened to him. When I said he had died in an accident, she expressed sympathy and asked if I wanted to talk about it. Her reaction seemed completely genuine, like she was hearing this information for the first time. But then she asked his name. The way she asked it felt deliberate somehow, like she was testing me just as I was testing her. I told her his name was Marcus, watching her face carefully for any reaction. She nodded and said it was a nice name, then changed the subject to our plans for the day. But I swear I saw something flicker across her expression, just for a moment, before she looked away. The rest of our honeymoon passed in a strange haze. During the day, everything seemed normal. We continued to enjoy each other's company, take beautiful photos, and make plans for our life back home. But every night, I found myself lying awake, waiting to see if Sarah would whisper that name again. She never did, at least not when I was awake to hear it. I began to notice other small things that I had previously dismissed. The way Sarah sometimes seemed to anticipate what I was going to say before I said it. How she knew exactly how I liked my coffee prepared, even though I was sure I had never told her my specific preferences. The way she could navigate to places in our hometown that she claimed to have never visited before. When we returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed between us. Sarah seemed exactly the same as always, but I felt like I was seeing her through new eyes. Every kind gesture, every moment of seeming understanding, every time she anticipated my needs, it all began to feel slightly artificial, like a performance rather than genuine intimacy. I started paying closer attention to the details of our relationship. I realized that Sarah had never really talked about her life before we met in any specific way. She would mention general things, growing up in Portland, studying psychology, working various jobs, but she never told stories with specific details that I could verify. She claimed to have few close friends from her past, and her family lived far away and rarely called. I began to feel like I was living with a stranger who somehow knew everything about me while remaining completely mysterious herself. The woman I had married seemed to know me better than I knew myself, but I realized I knew almost nothing concrete about her beyond what she had chosen to tell me. 3 weeks after we returned from our honeymoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds. I know it makes me seem paranoid and distrustful, but I couldn't live with the questions anymore. I needed to know who Sarah really was and how she knew my brother's name. I needed to understand what was happening to my marriage before it destroyed me completely. The investigator, a woman named Janet Coleman, was recommended by a colleague at work. She was professional and discreet, and she didn't ask too many questions about why I wanted to know more about my own wife's background. She simply took the information I could provide, Sarah's full name, date of birth, the details about her supposed childhood in Portland, and promised to get back to me within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I went through the motions of normal married life, but every interaction with Sarah felt loaded with hidden meaning. When she made my favorite dinner without me asking for it, I wondered how she knew it was exactly what I was craving. When she suggested we watch a movie that perfectly matched my mood, I found myself questioning whether it was intuition or something more sinister. Sarah seemed to sense that something was wrong, but when she asked about it, I deflected. I told her I was stressed about work, about adjusting to married life, about normal things that wouldn't make her suspicious. She was understanding and supportive, just as she always was, but even her support began to feel calculated somehow. When Janet finally called, her voice was grim. "We need to meet in person," she said. "This isn't something I can discuss over the phone." We met at a small cafe across town, away from anywhere Sarah and I usually went. Janet looked troubled as she spread a folder of documents across the table between us. "David," she said, "I'm not sure how to tell you this, but the woman you married doesn't exist." According to Janet's investigation, there was no record of Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, my wife's full legal name, existing before 5 years ago. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history, no family members who could be located. It was as if she had materialized out of thin air with a completely fabricated identity. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Janet had managed to trace Sarah's real identity through fingerprints and facial recognition software. Her real name was Rebecca Chin, and she had spent 4 years in a psychiatric facility in Oregon before disappearing from their care 3 months before I met her. The medical records that Janet had obtained through questionable but not illegal means painted a picture of a woman with severe psychological disorders, including something called erotomania, a delusional belief that another person is in love with her. But this wasn't just any case of erotomania. Rebecca had become obsessed with someone who had died, someone she had never actually met but had researched obsessively: my twin brother Marcus. According to the psychiatric records, Rebecca had somehow learned about Marcus's death and had built an elaborate fantasy around him. She had studied everything about his life, his family, his friends, his interests. She had collected photographs, newspaper clippings about the accident, even his high school yearbook. The doctor's notes described her as having an almost supernatural knowledge about someone she had never met, as if she had lived his life alongside him. But the obsession had eventually shifted. When the doctors tried to convince her that Marcus was dead and that her feelings for him were based on a delusion, Rebecca had begun to focus on me instead. In her mind, I was the closest thing to Marcus that still existed in the world. I was his genetic identical, the person who had shared a womb with him, the only way she could ever be close to the man she believed she loved. She had escaped from a psychiatric facility and had spent months learning everything she could about my life. She had studied my routines, my favorite places, my work schedule. She had learned about my coffee preferences, my childhood memories, my fears and dreams, all the details that had made me feel so understood and loved when we first met. The woman I married had orchestrated our entire relationship from the very beginning. She had gotten a job at the coffee shop she knew I visited every morning. She had crafted a personality that would appeal to me based on her research into what I found attractive. She had pretended to discover shared interests that she had actually identified through months of stalking. Every moment of understanding, every perfect compatibility, every time she had seemed to read my mind, it had all been an elaborate performance based on her obsessive study of my life. The woman I thought I had fallen in love with was actually a psychiatric patient who was using me as a substitute for my dead brother. Janet showed me security camera footage from various locations around town, dating back to months before we supposedly met. There was Sarah, or rather, Rebecca, following me to the grocery store, the gym, restaurants where I ate lunch. She had been watching me, learning my patterns, preparing for the moment when she would insert herself into my life. The worst part was realizing that she was good at it. Her performance had been so convincing that I had never suspected anything was wrong. Even now, knowing the truth, I could barely believe that the woman who had seemed so perfect for me was actually a dangerous stranger who had built our entire relationship on lies and delusion. I sat in that cafe for over an hour, staring at the evidence of my wife's deception, trying to process the magnitude of what I had learned. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage was false. The woman I had pledged to spend my life with was not only a stranger, but someone who was potentially dangerous to both of us. Janet asked what I wanted to do with the information. I could confront Sarah directly, but given her psychiatric history, that might be dangerous. I could contact the psychiatric facility she had escaped from, but that would likely result in her being forcibly returned to institutional care. I could simply leave, file for divorce, and try to rebuild my life, but that felt like abandoning someone who was clearly very ill. I chose the most difficult option. I decided to go home and pretend I knew nothing while I figured out how to help Sarah get the treatment she obviously needed. It seemed like the right thing to do, the compassionate choice that Marcus would have made if he were in my position. That decision nearly cost me my life. When I returned home that evening, Sarah was cooking dinner and humming softly to herself. She greeted me with a kiss and asked about my day, just as she always did. But now I could see the performance in every gesture, the calculated perfection in every word. She had prepared my favorite meal, opened a bottle of the wine I preferred, even put on the playlist that always helped me relax after work. As we ate dinner, I found myself studying her face, looking for signs of the mental illness that had driven her to create this elaborate deception. But she seemed completely normal, even happy. She talked about her day, asked about mine, made plans for the weekend. If I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes, I never would have believed that this sweet, caring woman was actually a psychiatric patient living under a false identity. After dinner, as we settled on the couch to watch television, Sarah curled up against me the way she always did. But now her closeness felt suffocating rather than comforting. I kept thinking about the security camera footage of her following me, the months of preparation that had gone into making me fall in love with her. "David," she said softly during a commercial break, "do you ever feel like we were meant to find each other?" The question sent chills down my spine. I managed to nod and make some appropriate response, but inside I was screaming. Of course she felt like we were meant to be together. She had engineered every aspect of our relationship to make me feel exactly that way. That night, I lay awake again, but this time I was terrified rather than confused. I was sharing a bed with someone who was not who she claimed to be, someone who had an unhealthy obsession with my dead brother, someone who had escaped from a psychiatric facility. I had no idea what she might be capable of if she realized that I had discovered her secret. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah began to move restlessly beside me. I held my breath, wondering if she was going to whisper Marcus's name again. Instead, she sat up in bed and looked directly at me. "I know you know," she said quietly. My blood turned to ice. In the darkness, I could barely make out her features, but her voice was completely calm and rational. This wasn't the voice of someone having a psychotic break. This was someone who was fully in control of herself and the situation. "Sarah," I started to say, but she cut me off. "My name isn't Sarah," she said. "But I think you've figured that out by now." I sat up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. I had no idea how dangerous she might be, and I was acutely aware that we were alone in our house, miles from the nearest neighbor. "Who are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I'm someone who loves Marcus more than you ever did," she replied. "I'm someone who understands what you lost better than you do. I'm someone who can give him the life he should have had." She reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. In the soft light, her face looked completely different than it had during our entire relationship. The gentle, loving expression I had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by something harder and more intense. "You let him die," she continued. "You had the chance to save him, and you chose not to. You've spent all these years feeling guilty about it, but you never really tried to honor his memory. You just buried it and pretended it never happened." "That's not true," I said, but even as the words came out, I knew she was partially right. I had tried to move on from Marcus's death rather than find ways to keep his memory alive. "I've studied Marcus's life more thoroughly than you ever bothered to," Rebecca said. "I know what he wanted, what he dreamed about, what made him happy. I know that he would have wanted to travel, to see the world, to experience everything life had to offer. I know that he would have wanted a family, children who could carry on his legacy." The way she talked about Marcus, as if she had known him personally, was deeply unsettling. But what was even more frightening was the realization that she wasn't entirely wrong about some of the things she was saying. I had tried to forget about Marcus rather than celebrate his life. "So you decided to marry me instead?" I asked. "To live out some fantasy about what your relationship with him might have been like?" "Not a fantasy," she said firmly. "A reality. You and Marcus were identical twins. Genetically, you're the same person. When I'm with you, I'm with him. When we make love, it's Marcus I'm holding. When we have children someday, they'll be his children too." The delusion was so complete, so detailed, that I realized there was no reasoning with her. In her mind, she genuinely believed that being with me was the same as being with Marcus. She had constructed an elaborate alternate reality where her obsession with my dead brother could be fulfilled through our marriage. "Rebecca," I said, using her real name deliberately, "Marcus is gone. He died 17 years ago. What you're doing isn't helping anyone, least of all yourself." Her expression changed instantly, becoming dangerous in a way that made me wish I had kept my mouth shut. "Don't call me that," she said, her voice sharp. Rebecca was the sick girl in the hospital. Rebecca was the one who couldn't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. I'm not her anymore. "Then who are you?" She smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "I'm the woman who loves Marcus enough to make sure he gets to live the life he was meant to have," she said. "Even if that means you have to die so he can take your place." That's when I realized that my life was in immediate danger. The woman I had married wasn't just delusional, she was homicidal. In her twisted logic, the only way for Marcus to truly live again was for me to die, presumably so she could maintain the fantasy that I was actually him. I got out of bed as calmly as I could, trying not to trigger whatever violent impulses she might be harboring. I think we should talk about this with someone who can help us, I said. Maybe a counselor or a therapist. She laughed, a sound that was completely devoid of humor. I've had plenty of therapy, she said. The doctors tried to convince me that Marcus wasn't real, that my love for him was just a symptom of mental illness. But they were wrong. Love doesn't die just because the person does. Love finds a way. She stood up and moved toward me, and I noticed for the first time that she was holding something in her hand. In the dim light, I couldn't tell what it was, but the way she was concealing it made me think it might be a weapon. Rebecca, please, I said, backing toward the bedroom door. You don't want to hurt me. I'm not your enemy here. You're right, she said, still advancing slowly. You're not my enemy. You're just in the way. That's when I ran. I made it out of the bedroom and down the hallway before I heard her following me. I didn't stop to grab my phone or my keys. I just ran for the front door, unlocked it as quickly as I could, and sprinted into the night. I ran to the neighbor's house and pounded on their door until they answered. Mr. Peterson, a retired police officer, took one look at my face and let me inside without asking questions. I called 911 while his wife called Janet, the private investigator, whose number I had memorized. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they entered my house, Rebecca was gone. She had taken some clothes, some cash I kept in a drawer, and my car. She had also left something behind. A detailed journal documenting her obsession with Marcus, including photographs, newspaper clippings, and pages of handwritten notes about our relationship. Reading that journal was like looking into the mind of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. She had written about Marcus as if he were still alive, as if she had conversations with him regularly. She had planned our wedding from her perspective and his, writing dialogue for both of us. She had even written about our future children, describing in detail what they would look like and how much Marcus would love being a father. The most disturbing entries were the ones about me. She wrote about me like I was a temporary inconvenience, something that needed to be dealt with so that she and Marcus could be together properly. She had researched different ways to kill someone that would look like an accident. She had considered poisoning, staged car crashes, even making it look like a suicide brought on by guilt over Marcus's death. The police issued a warrant for her arrest, but Rebecca had vanished completely. It was as if she had never existed, just like Sarah Morrison before her. They found my car abandoned at a bus station 3 states away, but the trail went cold after that. That was 6 months ago. I've moved to a different city, changed my job, and I'm slowly trying to rebuild my life. I go to therapy twice a week to process the trauma of discovering that my marriage was built entirely on lies and delusion. I'm learning to trust my instincts again, to recognize the difference between genuine connection and manipulation. But I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of her voice when she whispered my brother's name in that honeymoon bungalow. I still wonder where she is now, and whether she's found some other way to fulfill her obsession with Marcus. Most of all, I wonder if I'll ever be able to have a normal relationship again, knowing how completely I was deceived by someone I thought I loved. The police tell me that cases like this are rare, but not unheard of. There are people out there who become so obsessed with someone living or dead that they lose all sense of reality. They create elaborate fantasies and then do whatever it takes to make those fantasies come true, even if it means destroying other people's lives in the process. I've learned that the woman I married was never Sarah Morrison. She was Rebecca Chun, a psychiatric patient whose delusion was so complete that she was willing to commit murder to maintain it. The love I thought we shared was actually her twisted obsession with my dead brother, acted out through an elaborate deception that lasted for years. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never heard her whisper Marcus's name that night in the Maldives. Would I have lived the rest of my life in blissful ignorance, never knowing that my marriage was based on a lie? Would Rebecca eventually have found a way to kill me, or would the fantasy have been enough to sustain her indefinitely? I'll never know the answers to those questions. All I know is that one whispered name in the darkness changed everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the person I had promised to spend my life with. The scariest part is that even now, knowing everything I know, part of me still misses her. Not Rebecca, the psychiatric patient with homicidal tendencies, but Sarah, the woman who seemed to understand me perfectly. Even though I know it was all an act, even though I know she was using me to fulfill her obsession with Marcus, there were moments in our relationship that felt genuinely real and beautiful. That's the most insidious part of what she did to me. She didn't just lie about who she was, she made me fall in love with a person who never existed. The woman I grieved for after she disappeared was as much a fantasy as her love for my dead brother. I'm not just recovering from betrayal and deception, I'm recovering from loving someone who is never real. But I'm trying to move forward. I'm trying to honor Marcus's memory in healthier ways, talking about him with my parents and visiting his grave regularly. I'm trying to rebuild my ability to trust people and form genuine connections. Most importantly, I'm trying to forgive myself for not seeing the signs sooner. If there's anything I've learned from this experience, it's that love isn't just about feeling understood and accepted. Real love requires honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to be known completely by another person. What I thought was love was actually just very sophisticated manipulation by someone who had studied me like a subject in a psychological experiment. The woman who whispered